Peace and love. Welcome back, brothers and sisters. Before we get into this very important video, I would like to give you a brief introduction. This video is part one of an introductory overview that will attempt to explain the history of government and the New World Order, starting from pre-dynastic times up into the first ruling dynasties. This video will reveal one of the greatest deceptions of all time by explaining how time was manipulated, why the timeline was split when we talk BC and AD, and the true origins of humanity. Evolution is a Darwinian philosophy rooted in racism. Now, we know the Earth is more than 2,000 years old, but we're taught to believe that it is really year 2018 right now, and that prior to 7,000 years ago, humans were bow and arrow carrying apes. We're actually taught to believe that civilization just popped up in the Egyptian desert 7,000 years ago because of some bogus king named Narmer. Truth is that Greece and Egypt have many secrets regarding their true origins, and the secret societies of the world created evolution to hide our true human origins behind ape stories. What is the difference between pre-dynastic time and dynastic time? In the next series of videos, we will be going into all of these things in detail. But for the first two videos of this series, we will be doing an extended introductory overview of the entire timeline. Now, the picture you're looking at behind me is from a book called Gardens of War. And it talk about Stone Age wars. And this particular book talk about the Stone Age wars of New Guinea. But there were worldwide wars that was going on in what many refer to as the Stone Age. And it is these wars that hold a secret to how we got thrusted into today's New World Order. What were these first wars about? In the beginning, was the earth like what we know it today? I would say no. There's been many changes, and these series of videos will show you how we get from perfection to imperfection. If you're a Christian, you're aware that the Bible is also a historical book, which gives us a historical account from a mythological perspective. With that being said, we know that there was history prior to Genesis. Many Christians say this was the time when there were wars in the heavens. I got news for you guys. When the Bible talks about wars in the heavens, it's talking about the first wars that took place on earth that got humanity removed from the perfect Garden of Eden that the Bible speaks of. This Garden of Eden concept is a mythological story which gives an account of Stone Age civilizations. These Stone Age civilizations were written out of history so that people today will never know the truth about how great we once were. And the reason these Stone Age civilizations were written out of history is because they represent a golden age time that predates history. And it's called Herstory. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So the book behind me is called Gardens of War, and we all are familiar with the Garden of Eden. The first societies that lived and thrived on this earth were gardening-based societies, just like the Garden of Eden described. And they were ruled over by women who held the secrets of the seeds and the plants. The very first wars that took place were a series of wars that many like myself call gender wars, because these wars were about the genetics of humanity, the genesis of humanity. So to understand more of what I'm talking about when I speak of these gardens of war, let's get right into the presentation. Now, one more thing before we get into this presentation. In order for you to get the most out of this presentation, I beg of you to pause and read the captions on the screen. If you don't read the screen along with listening to my voice, you won't get the most out of the presentation. Some of you who've been following me for a while, some of the slides that's gonna pop up on the screen, you're already read them. But just a note to everybody watching this video, to get the most out of it, you have to pause and read the captions and look over the collages because I'm teaching with the visuals as well as my voice. So please pay close attention to the screen. If you blink, you might miss something, and you're gonna have to pause sometimes throughout the video to read the captions. But one thing to make it go smooth, when the screen change and a new collage or a new caption pop up, wait till I finish my next sentence and hit pause right there. And that way you don't pause in the middle of my sentence. And then when you finish reading the collage or the caption, you hit play and it's like you're in the middle of my sentence. You forgot what I was saying and you don't want to have to keep hitting rewind. So one thing I found out is when a new screen pop up or a new caption pop up, it'll stay up there for a couple of seconds or sometime even a couple of minutes. So you can wait until I finish my next sentence and hit pause right in between there. Go ahead and read over it and continue on with play. So with everything being said, guys, let's find out how we left the golden age of gardening-based societies and ended up into this new world order of slaughterhouses and GMO and all of that good stuff. And this is part 1 of Herstory to Hisstory. Let's get it. The main objective of this video is to reveal how the true record of human origins was hidden behind the timeline of evolution. To understand how and why this greatest deception was achieved, first we must understand how the record of humanity's past events was manipulated by splitting the timeline. The main split in humanity's timeline was history and prehistory. So the difference between history and prehistory has a lot to do with the way they were recorded. A lot of what we call history only come into existence with the invention of papyrus and text. But what we call prehistory can be traced back as far as 4 million years of human civilization, which doesn't consist of scrolls or texts, but inscriptions and carved figurines. Now, history began 7,000 years ago, and history is synonymous with what modern professors today call the dawn of civilization. The deception of it all is the word civilization and the implication of it. What modern science wants us to believe is that prior to 7,000 years ago, or prior to the year 3100 BC, because the year 3100 BC is said to be the beginning of history, which is synonymous with the beginning of quote unquote civilization. So in a nutshell, everything before 3100 BC is known as prehistory, and that's the area of focus that we will be focused mainly on today. But first, we got to deal with a lot of deception that took place to hide prehistory from you. So the year 3100 BC would be the year that is synonymous with the beginning of history, which is also synonymous with the dawn of civilization. Modern scientists want to convince us today that prior to the year 3100 BC, which was around 7,000 years ago, humans weren't civilized. And when they use the word civilized, they're referring to a primitive type Flintstone setting of a human. We've all seen these caveman type depictions of these dumbed down humans on a Flintstone type level. This is the type of human that they want to convince us existed prior to the year 3100 BC. Now, there was a transitioning area that we're going to go through in a minute, and we're going to show you how they say we transition from these two types of humans, as well as the true ancient account of our human origins. We will check them both out, and you can make up your own mind. Understand that history is basically the beginning of civilization and not the beginning of humans. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that most of the world make today, since most history is told to us from a perspective of in the beginning. The scientific account of history that's given to us by modern reverends of scientism is that billion years ago, of course, humanity evolved from a cosmic soup known as a Big Bang explosion. We'll talk about that later. But as that Big Bang timeline moved forward, we find that scientism parallels the world religions in the beginning. For example, the biblical in the beginning, which is 7,000 years ago, coincides with the beginning of civilization. So what are the powers that be hiding from us, and what is the timeline deception here? Well, we must understand that those in power we call world governments are at the foundation of world deception, and that the word government means to govern the mental. This is important when we talk about the difference between history and prehistory, because basically the word prehistory is synonymous with the word pre-dynastic. So when you want to research what life was like in prehistoric time, you have to research pre-dynastic records. And these pre-dynastic records were hidden behind the dynasties or the dynastic records. So the rise of the first pharaohs meant the creation of new calendars and a new age and the beginning of the new world order. And we'll talk about later why that pyramid is on the back of our dollars. The word prehistory is synonymous with the word pre-dynasty. So this was a time before humans were governed, or what scientists call civilized, basically when we were wild humans, as they call it. You think of the difference between a wild lion and a civilized lion, it would be the difference between a wolf or a coyote versus a Shih Tzu or a Chihuahua. One has failed from its wild state and failed into a more domesticated state. So the same thing happened to humans 7,000 years ago. There was a great shift in consciousness, and we left what was called in the Bible the Garden of Eden. Now, I'm just giving you a quick overview. We're going to go into all of this in detail. This Garden of Eden was also called a Golden Age. Now, everything prehistoric, again, is pre-dynasty. This was pre-government. This was the time when humans weren't ruled over by any dynasties, pre-dynasty, okay? Everything after this time is the dynastic age, and we've been in a dynastic age for the past 7,000 years where we've been ruled over by world governments that governs the mental of the masses, like herds of sheep. Prior to this, nature governed our actions and we live solely off the land. But what I want to teach in this series of videos is how the transition took place and also how pre-dynastic records were hidden by the dynasties, which is today's royal families. Basically, the book of Genesis is a book of genealogy or genetics of those royal families that assumed the throne and began a new world order. The new world order is also synonymous with 3100 BCE, the rise of Norma, the beginning of history, and the beginning of what they call civilization. When they so-called civilized the masses, is basically when they said, we tamed you. So we got to understand that everything prior to what they call civilization is pre-dynastic, and this is a cursed time. So this is synonymous with matriarchal societies that lived in autonomous villages that were governed by women gardeners. This is why Eve was cursed in the garden and man was given dominion over the women and children and animals. And we will talk about how the transitioning of ages and the drastic changes of social structure is synonymous with the changes of human diets and the way we interact with nature. This is why the Garden of Eden is a big change, a big shift, because we left our natural vegan diets and gardening-based social structures to being meat eaters, because the world was transitioning from gardening-based societies to hunting societies. After we were cursed from the garden, and this is just a mythical account of what literally happened what happened with the book of Genesis is that the pre-dynastic records were hidden behind this story. So the 4 million years of matriarchal societies that were vegan-based human cultures that thrived on this earth and lived under women gardeners, plant-based societies, that was hidden because they gave you the truth. They told you in the beginning there was a vegan-based type of human, which was Adam and Eve, but they lied about Adam being created first and woman coming from his rib. The ancestors taught that all things come from the womb of the woman, just like they do today. We're not pulling babies from men's ribs today, and you never saw it happen. So this is an unnatural thing that's contrary to what we naturally see. But we'll talk about that later. Now, this was all to hide the true lineage or genetics of humanity. By pulling the woman from Adam's rib, they had to create a womb on Adam to change the succession. So the book of Genesis starts the genetics of the royal families that rule over us. Prior to these royal families, we didn't have national flags. We had family crests, and you had inheritance to the land, just like animals do, based upon you being a natural human being born from the womb of your mother. You're part of a bloodline. So we traded that inheritance with the beginning that the Genesis story give us. And it gave us a new genetic story. And that day one that the Bible talks about is really day one of the Gregorian calendar. And that was 2018 years ago from today. We know that the earth is older than 2,000 years. Well, that's because if you start from day one and start going backwards, you would start counting up again, and you would be in BC era, which has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. And we're going to talk about that. This is before the common era. You got to understand that not everyone's Christians. So the BC don't means before Christ for everyone. Okay. And AD means Anno Domini, meaning year of our Lord, which was Norma, which was the first ruler when the dynasty set up shop and took us from pre-dynastic time. And that was the beginning of dynastic time that we're under today. So the first ruler in dynastic time was Norma. And there was 2 different rulers. We're going to talk about that. This is still an overview. We got to have this overview before we go in detail. We need to know the difference between pre-dynastic versus dynastic, or prehistory versus history. We need to understand how to navigate the timeline. History begins 3100 BC. The year 3100 BC, when we count up, we're going down on the year. So as we move up, we go to 2600 BC, 1786 BC, around the Middle Kingdom time, 1085 BC, around the New Kingdom. You go all the way down to 50 BC when the Greeks ruled. And you count down from 50 to day one, and that begins AD, which is where we at now. AD means Anno Domini, or the year of our Lord. So this AD is not AD for after death, meaning Christ. It means the year of our Lord. We're still in the year of Norma. His succession is carried on through the Pope. And there were 2 rulers, so you also have a Dalai Lama. So AD is Anno Domini, not after death. Norma is still dominating over us, even though he was mythified as Christ and many more other saviors today. He's really the founder of this new world order. And remember that the word domini means dominate. So again, we are in dynastic time where we are now being dominated by royal families or kings. So we are still within the kingdom of Norma. So we are being dominated by kings that rose to power after the gender wars, in which we'll get into later. So we're talking about a collaboration of wealthy families that have representatives for their networks. And that's how you get your Pope or your Dalai Lama. The first Pope and Dalai Lama were the first 2 kings of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this New World Order started 7,000 years ago with that unification in 3100 BC. So again, AD means Anno Domini, and we just explained what that means. It only means the death of Christ if you're referring to a Christian timeline, because the Bible has its historical account. So if you're referring to that account and you're a biblical believer, then Jesus would split your timeline. But if you're in another culture, it'll be another deity that split your timeline. But everyone is basically still being sold this Darwinian evolution timeline by their government, who's governing their mental. And this trick has been played on us for the past 7,000 years. The death has nothing to do with the death of Christ. It has something to do with the death of the matriarchy, the oldest pre-dynastic spirituality that we find was the worship of the womb that we all come from, or the uterus, and that was turned into Jesus on the cross with the two thieves. But prior to that, it was Adam and Eve with the tree of life in the middle. But that tree of life was cursed because the serpent that was wrapped around it was seen as evil in our time, when really that serpent goes back to the pre-dynastic Christian origins. When Christians weren't Christians, they were worshippers of the Minoan serpent goddess, and everyone had a version of this serpent goddess. We'll be talking about that. Christianity starts with Adam in Genesis. Prior to that, what we call Christians were called Minoans, and they worshiped the serpent goddess just like everyone else in the ancient world. And that serpent goddess is a personification of the female uterus. As I stated earlier, this is the oldest spirituality on earth. She predates Jesus because everyone had a great mother before these patriarchal deities. But you can see Jesus is a patriarchal representation of the female uterus. And for the first time on earth, when the patriarchs was in power, the female reproductive organ was now personified by a male. Again, this is why they had to create Adam a womb, and he had to produce children and women out of him. But if you look at this serpent goddess, you can see she indeed became Jesus Christ, or the cross, because the uterus is the crossroads by which we enter and exit the earth. It's what's called a great portal of life. And again, throughout this series, we'll be showing you how we transition from this matriarchal time to today's current patriarchal societies. So what happened to the 4 million years of matriarchal, Vegan-based societies? How was life during that time? What happened to the records of that time? Again, it was hidden by stories like what we read about in the Garden of Eden and the timeline of evolution. So where history begins, her story ends. And the reason I say her story is prior to the dynastic time, Mother Nature ruled. So again, what we call the beginning of time is not the beginning of natural time, because human origins can be traced back as far as 5 million years ago. So this beginning that we all grew up learning about is only a beginning that takes us back to 7,000 years ago with the rise of Norma. So the beginning of history today, most of us equate with the beginning of time, or the beginning of human origins, meaning the beginning of the earth. We don't realize that the biblical Genesis is not the beginning. It's the beginning of a new age. And the book of Revelation is not the end of the world. It's the end of an age. Because what we don't realize, when the Bible speak about the beginning of the world and ending of the word world translates to the word age. And this is very important. Want to keep this in mind as we move on. The last age ended 7,000 years ago, and the clocks was set back to day 1 from 3100 BC. So 3100 BC is the beginning of this age. So 7,000 years ago would have been the year Christ was born. Now the book of Genesis is also 7,000 years old. So now we see why Adam is just the first Christ. So 7,000 years ago would have been the birth of Christ. But 7,000 years ago was really the first dynasty and the first year of the rule of Norma. So that would have been the year Christ was born. And we also see why the book of Genesis is 7,000 years old and why Christ is a form of Adam or Atum and Norma or Menes. Day one, year one would have been when the Greeks took control of writing history. And when Manetho started writing about Norma, Manetho was writing long after Norma's death. So from 3100 BC, which was the beginning of the Old Kingdom or First Dynasty, to 1085 BC, which was the end of the New Kingdom. So we went from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom. That'll take us from 3100 BC to 1085 BC. Each of the kingdoms is split up by an intermediate period, which is kind of a transition in time, and we're going to talk about that later. But just to get a grasp of the timeline from 3100 BC to the third intermediate period, which ended around 525 BC. After that, the Persians ruled to 332 BC. And then when the Greeks started taking control and rewriting history from 332 BC all the way down to year one, you can see why everything we know about the first so-called Kemetic pharaoh comes from the Greeks. So when Manetho was telling us about Norma, he was telling us years after Norma's dynasty. So everything we know about Norma come from Greek historians. This account is what was being forged when they started so-called writing history, and they started everything from the beginning of the first dynasty, not the beginning of the earth. 3100 BC is said to be the beginning of writing. And as we travel the timeline and approach year one where BC meets AD, we can see that at this time the Greeks were in charge of writing history. So we can see during this time was the fashioning of all of the texts that control all of the world's main ideologies, what we know about our origins and all of that. But it predates to the first king or the first pope, not to the first humans, but the first families. You can see that as we approach year one, where BC meets AD, we're looking at Greek rule, Roman rule, Islamic rule, merged with Egyptian rule. And if you look at today's world, you can see the main influence of those entities being Islam, and Roman and Greek would be Christianity. So those are your two main world religions, Christianity and Islam. And you can see those main two on our timeline here as the main two entities that brought us into year one. So here we are in 2018, and these are the main two entities still ruling, still going to war, Christianity and Islam. And if you count up from day one, year one, to 2018, you can see how we get to this current year and how the timeline was split. And also, we know that the earth is older than 2018 years old. It's just been 2018 years since the split. We're talking about a time span of 5,000 to 7,000 years roughly. And this is how long they said civilization has been standing. And we just went over this word civilization and the context they're using it in to imply of primitive people who weren't tamed by male government, so to speak. So that was a transitioning phase, and this is how the timeline was split from BC to AD, because the first dynasties and the new age or the new world began 3100 BC. They was counting time down during this time. So when they reached day one, year one, they started counting back up again. And by then, the Romans and the Greeks had unified with Egypt. And this is how everybody is under this Gregorian calendar today. So what was going on prior to 3100 BC that led up to 3100 BC and there being a dynastic age that we're in today? How did we leave this great golden era, in which we're going to talk about? How did we leave this great golden era, which contains 4 million plus years of our human origins? And it was known by many as a time where we thrived in a sort of heavenly-like state, which is described in the Garden of Eden. How did we leave that and end up into this dynastic time and the beginning of a new calendar and new systems of government? How did we transition from it? To answer this question, we must understand that the first wars were gender wars based upon social differences. And we'll talk about these gender wars more in detail as we move on. Basically, Herstory is prehistory or pre-dynastic time, or before the time when male rulers ruled the world with governments and royal families or dynasties. It was the time when everyone was sovereign and lived freely with nature's inheritance. No one governed the land and the people. There were no man-made rules, only laws of nature. The creation of the timeline of evolution is a blasphemous joke that hides this 4 to 5 million years of human records of thriving gardening societies that existed on Earth. It hides that huge record behind a silly timeline of monkey-like creatures, ape-like creatures that came here from space. So this is your space monkey concept. You can see that 1 million years ago, it's the time of Homo erectus, or what they called a Flintstone type man. But you got to keep in mind he was half ape-like as well, because he came from Australopithecus. So they want us to believe that the species that originated today's humans was ape-like, and that everything prior to 3100 BC, what we call Herstory or prehistory, was the time of Flintstone-like, dummy-like humans, as you can see in this timeline in front of you. But what debunks this blasphemy is the fact that if we come from ape-like humans, we would still see ape-like humans walking around today. And this is why they have a huge need to sell you the Bigfoot and Sasquatch stories, to try to say, hey, here's the missing link. Here's the ape-like, human-like creature that we come from. But these things are only a myth. And if this was really true, that would be many, many Bigfoots around. It would be in the zoo. We wouldn't have to search all over. It wouldn't be a conspiracy. So the masses have been conspired upon by deceivers, and I'm just revealing that deception right now. If you look at this timeline of evolution, it's blasphemous, and it hides 4 million years of prehistory that they don't want you to know about, to show you the truth, who you really are and who you really come from, and what life was like when the earth was in its natural state, and the spirituality and mentality of the human was in its natural state. This was pre-dynastic time. Now, the beginning of the dynasties represent the beginning of the governments which govern the mental. So we left our true mental state. Now we're under a false mental state. The pre-dynastic humans didn't have the same social structure we have, and that's important to know as we get deep into this, to show you how we transition through the timelines and the great calendrical deception. So when you think about what I'm telling you here, that during the golden ages of humanity, it represents millions of years, as opposed to the 7,000 years of New World Order, dumbed down state that we've been in. That show you that this rule of governments and dynasties over the masses and the animals is very short. It's like a day compared to the millions of years of us living in our natural state. But I do want to show you how the transitioning took place. And in order to do that, I had to go through this overview. So thank y'all for being patient. Now, understand that everything prehistory or pre-dynasty that predates this anti-natural social structure that rules the world today is called uncivilized. And they want to convince you that everything prior to male rulers was stupid humans who, didn't have toilet paper because they were so dumb, and all of this old crazy crap, and I'm going to be proving in this series of videos that that's baloney, that we are the dumbed down humans, and that the far back we go, we see a more intelligent, more advanced human that was more in a natural state. So this is the planet of the ape theory, this whole timeline of evolution, and we're going to be cracking the cosmic code as we move forward. So again, they want us to believe everything during this golden age, when we were in our natural state, is considered uncivilized. But you have to keep in mind that the word civilized to them is really the word tamed. So all of the wars that was taking place during this transitioning phase of pre-dynasty to the rule of dynasties, because of course there were wars, people. It tell you that when you read about the unification of Kemet, which we're going to get into. This whole world structure that we're in today started as a result of war and bloodshed. Even your religious accounts tell you that. But they don't tell you what's before this, and that's the great deception. So in the beginning, whose beginning? Let's move forward. The wars that was taking place prior to this was gender wars, and I told you we'll get deep into those gender wars in a minute. But there were wars that took place for us to transition from pre-dynastic to dynastic. No one just willingly said, I want someone to rule over me. They ruling over you because they won the war, and now the patriarchs are in power. When the people rule over the earth, the matriarchs ruled. And they didn't rule over anyone. It was the laws of nature and what's called heavenly matrimony and all of that. We're going to get deep into that. We went over the evolution timeline deception, how they hid all of this golden age history, or should I say her story, behind his story. And when we talk about his, we're talking about Normer, which was the first sun god. And that's the god that everyone's worshiping today. We're going to get into that. There's so much to tackle, so we got to stay on subject, but we're going to get into all of these things throughout the series in detail. Let's finish the evolution timeline deception and wrap up the difference between pre-dynasty versus dynastic time, what we're in today. This dynastic time is known as the New World Order, the beginning of male rulers, as I stated. Before we were civilized, we were uncivilized, or what's called untamed. In other words, we were wild humans. And that's something you want to keep in mind, because everything in its wild state is in its natural state, but humans aren't. So when we were untamed, we were free of government rule and we were in our natural state. So untamed is unchained, and something that is wild is free. And you can look at that on many levels, because a wild animal is free of the suffering of a animal that may be bred in a slaughterhouse or on a zoo or domesticated in the house in its unnatural state. Also, when you look at plants that are wild, they are free. They are not ruled over by man, and they get to grow wild and generate as they will. But on another level, when we talk about wild and free, things in the wild is free to those who exist in the wild. So when you go off the grid and you live off the earth, everything is free for you. You don't pay no more bills. You don't work for nobody. You just live by the work of your own labor, of that connection you have with the earth, and she provides for you. We're not in our natural state. So we are in a fallen state, so to speak. But it's not because what was taught to us in the book of Genesis. It's not because a woman bit an apple. How we left the Garden of Eden to today's man-ruled world where you got to work every day, this slave system, has a lot to do with the changing of humans' diet. So the Bible tell you we were vegans, and after that we became to be meat eaters. So all of these changes of ages and transitions of human consciousness are synonymous with changes of the way we eat and interact with nature. And we didn't get to this fallen state by women biting an apple or biting fruit. We got to this fallen state by men hunting the animals. Everything on earth was vegan until the first couple of male hunting cults broke the first natural laws, which is live and let live. We have a symbiotic relationship with the plants, and we're supposed to eat the plants. If we don't eat the plants don't reproduce. This is why the flowers attract the bees to them. The apple tree have a scent. The orange tree have a citrus smell. And that's a perfume fragrance of nature seducing you, saying, come get you one of these oranges off of here. An orange is not running away from you. An animal is, and it's crying. It's trying to get away. Nature is telling you the rules of how to live here. It wants you to eat the fruit and spit the seed out. How I know? Because if you ever ate an apple, the apple is delicious, but try biting into the seed. It's bitter. You automatically spit it out. Nature is smart. It's programmed to make you do what you need to do so that everything reproduces. We're supposed to be on plant-based diets, spitting out our seeds on the ground so that the fruit can reproduce. But since we left the Garden of Eden, or we left these plant-based societies, all of the plants today are GMO. They're created basically in factories. They're not even created natural anymore, because the natural process would be humans walking around grazing upon the trees like the cows and the herds of animals and defecating and dropping the seeds on the ground. That's fertilizing. You know, when you swallow a seed and you poop, that's fertilizing and it's growing more seeds. So it's a symbiotic relationship and a duty that we have, a relationship we have with the plants. Everything was vegan prior to the first male hunting cults messing up the ecosystem, which is very fragile. The earth we live in is fragile. The first hunters that hunted the first wildlife set off a chain reaction. And now we live in a predator-prey world today. Once you start hunting one species, not even two or three, we can just use one. If you just start hunting up one species, that one species is responsible for a plant. Every species is bonded to a certain family of plants that it's able to digest to help that plant family reproduce. So certain animals eat certain plants we don't eat, and we eat certain plants they don't eat, and sometimes we eat the same. But this symbiotic relationship is necessary for reproduction. The humans have this marriage with the plants. When we started hunting the animals, that messed up the natural system, and the animals that we made go extinct, certain plants went extinct with them because those animals were responsible for helping those particular plants reproduce. So for example, if all the bees go extinct, there will be a lot of different flowers associated with nectar and honey that will go extinct because they need those bees to help them reproduce. So if you take away one thing, there's like a domino effect of everything falling. And we'll get deep into that domino effect later. I want to skip around with the overview showing you that Eden represents this 4 million plus years of gardening or gathering societies that predate what they call civilization, or tamed humans that own slaughterhouses. So a lot of this series later is going to get into veganism. You notice that when people raise their consciousness, they start eating different. That's because the major shifts in consciousness on the earth coincided with changes in diets and the way we interacted with nature, as I said earlier. So today what we call history is often mistaken as the beginning of time or the beginning of humanity. But really it's the beginning of this Greco-Egyptian social structure that governs the entire world today in some form. So we know that the power pyramid is broken down from the royal families all the way down to your Masonic lodges, which breaks down to Scottish Rite and Prince Hall. And this is your double-headed dragon. Scottish Rite Prince Hall is Greco-Egyptian. There's a dual hand that keeps this system going. Masonry started with the rise of the first male hunting cults. This was your first form of male secret societies, and you're going to learn more why that is so as we move forward. Now, the main two societies that influenced this New World Order were Egypt and Greece. So often the beginning of history is argued to be in either of the two. But we know that the Greeks were influenced by the Egyptians and vice versa. This was a marriage that took place in 3100 BC with the unification of Egypt. So this unification was the Greeks or the Romans blending their culture with the Egyptians, creating what would become the Western world as we know it today, which is highly influenced by these two past cultures. So we're in a Greco-Egyptian time, which is called a dynastic era. And you can see the influence that these past two world superpowers still hold today on the world. Even when you look at an American dollar, you can see the influence of those two past superpowers. You can see the Greek-style architecture, Roman-style columns on your money, as well as the Egyptian-style pyramids in architecture. You know, they have a Memphis here that they rebuilt in Tennessee that has a pyramid as well. And Memphis is one of the Masonic capitals. And we understand that at the nation's capital in D.C. is built just like the initiation pool of the pharaohs who began this New World Order. And this is also why a lot of the deities that influence the world have the same storylines, because there was a blending that took place. And basically the two superpowers that unified during this time adopted the same customs and traditions and made blended deities. Before the unification of Egypt, the land was settled with autonomous villages. This was what's known as the Golden Age and represents this 4+ million years of human civilizations that predate the beginning of civilization. Now think about what I said. They said the beginning of civilization was 3100 BC. But if I can show you people that were, quote unquote, civilized before that time, then it shows you that this beginning isn't a real beginning of our true human origins. The real beginning is before the unification of Egypt, or before the Greeks unified with the Egyptians and created the first major powerhouses that unified to put us in this new world order today. I just want to add that the biggest deception was they got us waiting for the new world order, but we've been in it for the past 7,000 years. A lot of things that we say coincide with the new world order is a new age and a one world religion. But if you think about that, that new age and that one world religion was created during this transition in time. And that one world God that was being worshipped under this one world religion was known as Menes or Normer. And he's Jesus, Zeus, Pan, and basically every deity that ruled in spirituality and mythology post-goddess era. So everything that came after the pre-dynastic time or everything during the dynastic time represent the age of male deities. Prior to this, there were only female deities that ruled as the singular source, showing you that this singular source is also the womb that all life come from, which is attached to the woman. So they had to curse that woman in the biblical Genesis in order to change the succession from matrilineal to patriarchal. So what happened in Genesis was all of those millions of years of matriarchal spirituality and gardening-based societies was deleted, and your natural inheritance was taken, because your natural inheritance was given to you through your family bloodline. But in Genesis was the beginning of a new ruling bloodline. That's why it's called Genesis, dealing with genes or genetics. And the Bible is just a book of royal succession of the patriarchs taking over after the matriarchs. So Adam now begins the royal lineage of humanity. And now all things are birthed from the man. So they created a womb on his rib when they put him in the place of the great womb, a.k.a. the cosmic mother. All of the ancients said we all come from the great womb. So that was hijacked in Genesis. Adam is also Normer, or the first sun god, known as Atum. But when you flip his name backwards, it's matter or mother, matter, because all matter is made from the mother or the motor, the matter, the mother. So you can see the truth when you flip his name backwards, because the mother was desecrated behind these patriarchal bastards. Excuse my language. So in a nutshell, what the biblical Genesis story tells you is that the woman and the child was now cursed, and man was given dominion over the plants, animals, the women, and the children. That man who was given dominion was Adam. He's also known as Atum or Narmer, the first pharaoh who rose to power. It also shows you how we journeyed away from the tree of life, which is the worship of the uterus and the great womb. And we journeyed away from having family crests, which gave us a natural inheritance. And we journeyed into this dynastic time of now you no longer have a family crest that represents your natural inheritance. You have a national flag that represents your national slavery. The flags represent everything that the patriarchal gods represent, a system of death. The flag is rectangular, just like the coffin. So the symbol of the royal family crest shapes like the uterus, which is life. And we'll go deeper into that as we move on. So now that we got an understanding of the differences of prehistory and history, we understand that basically history is the beginning of civilization, or when Egypt unified and world governments and royal families started ruling over what's called peasants. Today would be civilians. You know, the people, the sleeping giant, the 95% that makes up the poor, not the 10% trillionaires that rule over it all. Those are the royal families. These are the ones who you can trace their succession through the Bible. So God's chosen people are ruling over the world. And this chosen people have always historically been the royal families. And they can trace their succession back through this mythological text, which is another form of Hisstory, meaning Narmer. So that's why when you read the Bible, it's very careful to keep an order of that genealogy. So often when you open a lot of books, the first chapter is full of who begat who and such begat who and such begat who, because this is a book that's keeping the succession of a royal lineage. But they recreated the origin of humans and got us being born through biblical bloodlines like Ham, Shem, and etc. When the patriarchs assumed the throne, they had to change the royal succession with all of the humans, animals, and women and children going behind the first king. So Adam gave birth to it all, and the succession come after Adam, who is at the top of that royal lineage, him and his families. And that's when we deal with mythology. Adam just really represents the first world rulers or the first ruling families in this patriarchal time. They say we were born through Noah, and prior to that through Adam and Eve. But there was a beginning prior to Adam and Eve, and that's what we're talking about now. Adam and Eve represents the beginning of patriarchal time and us leaving the garden. That garden is pre-dynastic time, or the golden age. The golden age is the Garden of Eden, when everything was heavenly and the world was in vegan-based societies and nothing hunted the animals. There were plants that existed then that you never heard of today. Today we live in a ghost-like world where there's a lot of things missing based upon this great fall, and we'll be going deep into that. The unification of Egypt is celebrated by a lot of initiated men, but rebel warriors like myself do not celebrate it, because we understand that that is the beginning of the first form of what we call today the United Nations. The first two powerhouses to unite were Greece and Egypt, and these are the main two cultures that influence the world today. Pope Gregory's calendar is the foundation of all of the timeline deception, as well as the space programs and everything that will be associated with the calendar, such as the movement of the stars and all of this. They had to make the timeline deception possible. So why was a new calendar necessary? Because pre-dynastic calendars were centered around crops, planting, gardening, and patriarchal modern-day calendars such as the Gregorian calendar were mainly centered around the movement of herds and hunting and the succession of the rulers at that time. This is why time is off today. They got us away from syncing time by the stars Everyone under Pope Gregory's spell has their time synced up with the succession of the popes and the royal families. All of the world religions and scientism's timeline of evolution. Everyone today under Pope Gregory's spell also have their timeline split by a sun god, which is a representative of Norma for that culture, because he was called by different names to different cultures, just like the Pope is today. This is why Jesus split their timeline, or some god split their timeline. That god is equivalent of this first male ruler who ruled under a unified Egypt, and he was known by many names, and he became the many male sun deities that rule the world today. So we know that the unification of Egypt was the beginning of the New World Order, and we've been in it for the past 7,000 years. But prior to the unification of Egypt, the land was settled with autonomous villages. That's important because autonomy is another word for sovereign, meaning villages that were ruled over by nature. The word auto is related to automatic. Autonomy is automatic, meaning that in our natural state, we would have automatically got hungry and ate fruit from the trees like the animals do. We would have done that naturally. We would have known when we smelt that apple tree that, hey, that's food. I can solve this growling stomach by eating that. It's programmed in us to do that naturally or automatically. So a word that can be synonymous with the word natural is automatic, because naturally when you're born, your heart starts the beating. When you're conceived, you have a heartbeat, and that heartbeat is done automatically. You don't have to do it manually. Your heartbeat is automatic, and it happens naturally. So natural and automatic is synonymous in a lot of contexts. So before Egypt was unified, the land was settled with autonomous villages, people that automatically lived the way nature intended. They did things that we would do naturally, like plant seeds in the ground, grow more trees, and you would naturally be a vegan because you wouldn't naturally go up to a baby chicken and say, that looks like a meal. If you gave a child a baby chicken, it would play with it, not try to eat it. Meat eating isn't natural, and the body wasn't naturally meant to digest meat. And like I said, we'll get into how veganism and the change of the diets over the timeline play into us being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, or our vegan days when humans were vegans naturally. You see, hunting required tools, and the first humans didn't have sophisticated tools to do the kind of hunting that we do today to feed their villages. Naturally, what was the most easiest and simplest thing to do was to be vegan and be gathering-based societies. And the word gather is in the word to gather. These autonomous villages were family-based villages ruled over by women who understood the seed, the plants. If you look at women today, they are the #1 planters and gardeners. My grandmother had a garden. Many of your grandmothers had a garden. Women are the #1 people with green thumbs on earth to this day. If you just look at a cookout, it's always the man on the grill and the women prepping the vegetables and spices and herbs. And if you think about meat eating versus veganism, when I was a meat eater, I couldn't eat meat if it wasn't seasoned. And that says a lot, because the fact that meat only tastes good to most of us if we season it with the plant show you that you might as well just be eating the plant and not the meat. The animal ate the plant, so why wouldn't you go directly to the source? So the world we live in today with the slaughterhouses and not allowing the animals to move freely creates more deserts on the earth, because the animals help spread the plant seeds throughout the earth. So when we trap these animals on plantations and create slaughterhouses, a lot of places go barren. The rulers of the world have gotten in between humanity and nature by taking ownership of the plants and packaging the fruit. and making you pay for it, as opposed to during this time of autonomous villages, you went directly to the source or the tree. Nature already made a package for that orange. Why do you need a man to pick it off of that tree and put it in a bag with his name on it? It already come in the package. It got a covering on it. Why you need it to be repackaged and sold to you when nature gave you that tree freely? This ties into what I was telling you about Adam gaining dominion over the earth and the animals and the plants after we was tossed into this New World Order patriarchy. When man was given dominion over the earth, things were redefined and renamed to show the power of those who were in charge during the time. For example, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar renamed months after themselves. There's animals and different plants renamed after men that were great to these societies. So what I'm saying is that when you look at fruits and vegetables in the grocery store, they're always going to be packaged and labeled by man. You can't really patent an orange, but you can package and label an orange, just like you can brand a slave and make that slave yours. But you by nature can't really own a human or own a plant or own a tree. It's all given to us freely. When things are packaged and labeled, that's what you're paying for, the package and the label. But the fruit is free. It's free when it comes in nature's package. But when man repackage it, you have to pay him for his labeling. And this is all part of the game and the New World Order slave system. And they want to get rid of seeds out of the fruit so that no one can reproduce plants. And they will have a monopoly on nature, so to speak. They want to do this with the human seed as well. They don't want humans to be reproduced through the woman's womb any longer. They don't want humans to be born. They want humans to be manufactured. They don't want humans to have a birthmark. They want you to have a barcode. The future that they're working toward, humans will no longer have mothers. They will have designers. See, this time, what I'm talking about when we were freely able to go into nature and be sustained was called a time of autonomous villages. And remember that the abbreviation for goal is AU. So things that are automatic, like during this time of autonomous villages, when we were in our automatic or natural state, it's called a golden age. And remember, goal is AU. So when we talk about autumn, which is harvest time, autonomous villages, automatic, that's dealing with nature, which is golden. This is the true currency. The people that's making the killing today is through natural resources, and natural is natural. There is no money without nature. Even when you print money, you need the tree. Everything that money is spent upon wouldn't be possible without nature. So who controls nature rules over the world, and that's where we at today. There was no need for no one to rule over the world because nature governs itself. It's a self-sustaining system. All we got to do is participate. But we've been absent from that system the past 7,000 years because of the rise of this patriarchal social structure or this New World Order system that we're under today. So New World Order is synonymous with dynastic age. And the opposite of the New World Order would be the old world laws of nature. So the New World Order was built upon those natural laws. And under this New World Order, everything in nature is dominated because the order comes from the kings, those two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is really the two powers of Eastern and Western world, the Pope and the Dalai Lama. So New World Order is really New World Chaos. We left the old world order of nature. This New World Order means everything dominated under the orders of the powers that be or the king. So before this NWO style system that we're under today, and before Norma, before the unification of Egypt, the land was settled with these autonomous villages, which were agricultural small settlements up and down the Nile River Valley. And we got to keep in mind that these type of settlements were not only exclusive to the Nile, but the humans during these times were living in autonomous village type settings or settlements, which mostly were based up and down valleys. So the Nile River Valley was one. The Indus River Valley was another one. And there were many more river valley settlements that date back to pre-dynastic time. The Amazon was another river valley which held a lot of these autonomous village settings during pre-dynastic time and still does today. Humans thrived along valleys in our natural state, and we depending on the annual or yearly flooding of those valleys for crop production. So this is where your flood stories came into play of Noah and etc. These flood stories talk about all life being recreated after a flood. And this happens annually or yearly in a lot of places, even to this day. It happens every springtime in a lot of places that's near valleys and fertile areas. But this was hidden in mythology. But this is our true human origins. We were villagers who settled along river systems. And these river systems were also traffic highways of how we moved about the land. The first highways were dominated by boat systems along these cultural river valley settlements. So this was before the unification of Egypt, or basically before the world powers start to unify and turn on the people. And we will go into exactly how those world powers were created and who those powers are and how they come from amongst those villages to rule over us all today. I will be going into that. So before we do that, remember the difference between history or dynastic time and prehistory or pre-dynastic, pre-government time. Humans were not dummies before the government. That's basically what we want to keep in mind. So the unification of Egypt represents the beginning of government. And this is why that pyramid is on $1. We're going to get deep into that. Before this unification, there were gender wars based upon matriarch and patriarch concepts, which we need to understand to see how we left gardening societies that was ruled over by women to hunting-based societies that we are today, where there's many slaughterhouses and people diets are meat-based, and we call the vegetables side dishes. But back in these days, there were no side dishes. The only dish was all fruits and vegetables. It was vegan-based. And how we go to being mainly meat eaters today in these hunting/vampire-based societies, how we go to that from pre-dynastic vegan-based villages, societies. In a nutshell, during the time when we were in these village vegan settlements, during this golden age, there was still a system of laws that was handed down to the villages by the matriarchs, and the women had given us all laws. Basically, it was what we call today the law of karma, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Meaning you wouldn't want nobody to hunt you and fry you and eat you and put you on some bread. You wouldn't want to be in a slaughterhouse. They said if most of us had to hunt our own food, that most of the world would be vegans if you had to hunt and kill your own food. Because I don't think you can pick up a little furry baby, little yellow fluffy chicken and just break its neck and start peeling it and skinning it to make you some McDonald's nuggets. I don't think you can do it. Do you have the heart? So the law of nature is written in our heart. It's called compassion and consciousness. We left that law with the creation of the biblical laws and religious laws, which now you look in a book to tell you what's right from wrong, when really the books got us behaving evil, because all of the gods who control the books got us going to war and killing each other. They condone slavery, raping of women, and the hunting and killing of animals. They condone rich and poor. Some people blessed, some people not. But during this golden age, we had a different type spirituality that predates all of these unnatural concepts. Everyone was equal and everyone sowed seeds on the land. And every time you sowed seeds, you was creating good karma because you give and take. When you eat an apple, you plant a seed and grow 1,000 more apples. So this was a golden age, or a time of abundance, because all of the land we walking on was used to reproduce the fruit. And it was the Garden of Eden. There were plants and fruits as far as your eyes can see for miles and miles and miles and miles. Plants and fruits that we don't even know about today. And the earth was a fruitful golden place, abundant. So all of this land around us was used efficiently, and the earth was fruitful. And it was not only nature's vegetation that spread, but the seed of humanity spread with it. Because like I said, we have a symbiotic relationship with the plants. As I said, as far as your eyes can see, there was abundance in vegetation. Today, when you look at our world, as far as your eyes can see, you see concrete jungles and highway systems and roads designed for slaves who keep the system going. But before all of these roads, which are more like hamster wheels, there was abundance. And before we lived in industrial cities, we lived in heavenly gardens. But when we started hunting the animals, the creation of deserts began. There was a snowball effect in the food chain pyramid because man is at the top of that pyramid. So we would cause that trickle down effect, or that snowball effect. And this is how this new world was created. This predator prey world was created. This is not the creation of the Most High. This is the creation of those evil ones in power. One of the main laws of the village back during this matriarchal time when women gardeners ruled was to live and let live, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When we broke that law, and the first male hunters established cults because you had to hunt in secrecy. Of course, it was not allowed during this time. So there's the beginning of your first male secret societies right there, because you had to hunt in secrecy. So when they went out to the woods, they hunted and they got a taste for blood or a taste for meat. And meat was like a drug. They would smuggle meat back to the village, and certain people would start sneaking eating meat, and it was against the law. But this was when we slowly start to fall. Before this, no one was sneaking doing nothing. We was all following the rules. I'm just showing you how we left vegan-based human societies to get to these modern meat-eating societies today. It happened with the first males breaking the first laws against the village, and it wasn't exclusive to just males. After the laws was breaking, people start craving meat. So the first male hunters were like the first rock stars to the villages. When we talked about those gender wars, how did we go from pre-dynastic to dynasty? It's how did we go from all being vegans to being addicted to meat? Because when we were all vegans, no one ruled over us. And there was no laws against you planting a seed and owning many plants as you want. So it was a golden age. No one starved and everyone ate because we was all vegans, and plants and fruits was abundant. But with all that abundance, there was a couple of males in the villages who broke the laws that was laid down by the matriarchs. And one of the main laws being live and let live, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We broke that law when we started hunting males, and that messed up the natural ecosystem of nature. And ever since then, there was a slow fall from our natural vegan state. And these changes of the human diet coincide with changes of ages and conscious shifts, because how we interact with the land and nature is based upon the state of consciousness we in. You can see we in a very low state of consciousness today, where there's thousands and thousands of slaughterhouses and polluted water, and basically everything that's natural, that we naturally need to sustain us, is polluted, and everything that's unnatural is what's well kept and going, such as your slaughterhouses and your chemical-based products. Everything that's unnatural is what rules today, and all natural things are becoming more and more GMO and modified. So in order for this unnatural social structure to maintain itself, it has to constantly keep a demand for unnatural things. And that's where we are today. But slowly but surely, the truth is coming back, and you see a lot of people going more toward the natural and the vegan-based thing because it's the end of this conscious shift. So her story to his story, I'm showing you how we left Eden. Eden is nothing but a time when humans were vegans. Now, the Bible told you we left Eden because women bit an apple. I'm telling you, we were kicked out of Eden because men started biting the animals. They told you in the Bible that there was a tree in the middle of the garden that had a forbidden fruit on it. I'm telling you that when you do your research, you see that that forbidden fruit were the animals of the earth. Us humans were the first hunters ever. We was the first predators, and we destroyed our own paradise. So this is truly paradise lost based upon a ripple effect of our actions that took place. And this is really to the males, because your first hunters were males. It took brute force. It took male strength to hunt. And again, most of your women's was still in the garden during this time, dealing with the seeds and the herbs. So if you think of that movie, The Hunger Games, that's what they telling you about, because in the movie, you had the poor people who was in these slums participating in games that was owned by the rich who was wealthy and running everything. And the games were based on hunger. So this Garden of Eden, you can look at the word Eden as literally eating. It was all based upon how we was eating, which was you are what you eat. What we eat and how we think is a symbiotic thing. So you notice that the changing of ages is linked to the changing of human diets. The role of the male during this time was a builder. This is where we get the term mason, which is a builder or a son of the month who builds her house. During this autonomous village time, during this golden age, men, we built the villages, and it was a series of teepee-like huts that were in a huge circle going outward from the central hut, which would be where the matriarch would be. So in the middle of these villages, the great-great-great-grandma and granddaddies would be at the hut in the center, or the huts in the center, and all the families and generations would extend outward from the center. So you can actually trace the family lineage by walking from the middle hut outward, and the far outward you going down the generations. So it's a big ripple effect, and that's what the black stone worship at Mecca is showing you, and what a simple ripple effect in nature is showing you. And I recommend that you go look at my 2 videos on the ripple effect, Rupes Nigra, and tie it in with this one, because those videos show the origins of the cosmos according to the ancients. So the son of the month is the light that emanates from the mother, because the mother represents the darkness. But what happens in darkness come to light. So when a woman pregnant, you know when that belly starts to bulge outward, just like light rays bulge outward from someone who's shining, that would be that mother. She shines through her child or her son. So the mason builds the house of the mother, who is the architect. The word ark is dealing with the pregnant belly. She's the grand architect, or what the Masons call the queen of heaven is what we call the divine feminine. And men, we are the Masons, or the archangels, who are the builders. She lays the plan, which is the law. That's Ma'at. And we enforce the law, or build the house. And this is micro and macro, because even when the woman is pregnant, the son or the child builds the house and pitches that tent in her belly. And when that son is born, he go and fetch that wood and builds the house. And this is how it has always been. Women has made up the majority of the teachers of the society, and men have generally known to be the builders of a society. Now, don't get me wrong. We know both sexes are both students and teachers. So this is also a symbiotic relationship. The women manufacture the humans, and the humans manufacture the village. That itself is a ripple effect. And you can see this very same concept in a beehive with the queen bee manufacturing the bees and the bees building and maintaining the hive. And wherever the queen decides to move, wherever she lands, each bee abandon the hive and build a new hive around her. So this is a ripple effect. Understand the role of the women is very significant since they manufacture what we call the human being. The women's job was to teach about the seeds, the herbs, the spices, the plants, show what stuff that was good to pair together. They were botanists, show you how to crossbreed, how to plant different plants, which plants are used for herbs, which plants are used for this, which ones are for that. If you look at women throughout history, that's always been their role. And we actually give women fruit for their role in teaching about the secrets of nature through the seeds. The number one sets that make up teachers in today's world are women, and we give them apples. And this is symbolic to represent this golden age when we were all vegans. Now, that forbidden fruit in the Bible is often depicted as an apple. Many argue what it was, but what I'm telling you is the forbidden fruit wasn't the apples and the oranges. It was those beautiful animals in the garden that us men started hunting, and we broke one of the most important laws of nature when we did that. And also by doing that, created the first male secret societies that would rule the world based on your hunger for meat. And I will show you how that's possible. You see, when we depended on plants, we depended on the knowledge of the gardeners, and everyone was gatherers. And again, the word gather is in the word to gather. When we gathered as a family, and this what helped the family structure stay tight as well. But when the males started breaking the rules, we left gathering societies into hunter-gathering societies. So there was a slow transition. But before we went to hunter-gathering societies, how we fell from the gathering societies, which were the very first ones. The gathering societies are the gardening societies, or what's called a golden age. The beginning of the hunter-gathering societies is the beginning of the new age and the end of that old golden age. We went from hunting, gathering, all the way up into today where it's mostly just hunting. No one gathers anything anymore but a bunch of frozen meat. And the few vegetables you do have is little side dishes. So we're no longer gathering or gardening societies today. We're mainly parasitical or vampire hunting, predatorial societies today. And I'm just showing you how we fell from that garden, vegan, golden state to this fallen state of just a barbaric nature. And like I said, capitalism, slaughterhouses, and just being predators. So when you look at the evolutionary timeline, you see that these millions of years of gardening-based societies that thrive were hidden behind this Flintstone-type human who's a dummy walking around with a big old chicken bone drumstick in his hand. Now, that's really blasphemous because here it is, I'm telling you, we are that dumbed down, ignorant society and generation who's walking around dumbed down, full of meat, or carrying a big chicken drumstick. That Flintstone type of human is us, not the pre-dynastic ancestors. So do I believe in evolution? To a certain degree. The only thing I think exists is de-evolution. I don't think that the creator that created this beautiful creation needed things to evolve into so-called perfection. They're telling you that things evolve from this Big Bang cosmic soup to primitive, dumb cave monkey-like space monkey humans to people walking around with cell phones polluting the ocean. That's some major leap in evolution, huh? It just seemed like a big zoo or experiment But that's not the true nature of the Most High. When you study nature, you see it's beautiful and perfect. And the only thing flawed about it is the behavior of the masses upon this earth and the societies we're creating that goes against the system of nature. So I believe everything was created perfect in the beginning, and there was no need for anything to evolve to be greater, because there can be nothing greater than perfection. What the Most High created in the beginning was perfection. What we see today is chaos, and they're trying to maintain order out of that chaos. That's what the New World Order is about. You've been convinced that the world you live in today is smarter and more advanced than the world we find as we rewind time. Well, guess what? That's blasphemy, because if you rewind time all the way back to the beginning, they saying the farther back you rewind it, the dumber the creation get. So you do the math. If you keep rewinding it back, they're telling you that the creator is a dummy, and that when the creator created everything, it was a primitive creation that was dumb as hell, and it had to evolve through man's creation into a beautiful, perfect world with chemtrails, fluoridated water, and cell phones. And this is supposed to be an even swap. It's baloney. The creator created perfection, and that was a natural system that I've been explaining here. That system existed during the Golden Age, also known as the Goddess Age. Herstory. And Herstory was hidden behind Hisstory. So during this time when we were under matriarchal systems and living in gardening societies where women were the lawmakers, everything was divided up evenly. There was really no need to measure or divide up anything, because you got to keep in mind, during these early times, there was so much abundance. This was a paradise. There wasn't all of these deserts. There was trees so huge. There was fruits and plants and stuff, like I said, about 1 million species we never heard of. And no one went hungry. If there was that many plants and the earth was like that now, there would be no need for a government. There would be no homelessness. The trees and the land supported us abundantly. You think that the Most High that created this creation didn't create enough to sustain it? That's blasphemy. The deceivers got us fooled with that type of logic. They want you to think that the Most High didn't create enough in this creation to sustain us, that the little bit that is here, they can reduplicate it to make it be enough for everybody, and we got to pay them in the grocery store, when all you really got to do is pay the earth by putting the seed in the ground, not by putting the coin in the register. So how did we transition, and what is the nature of these gender wars? We know that the males started to break this golden rule, which is do unto others as you have them do unto yourself. And we started hunting the animals, which were the forbidden fruit. They flipped it on you. The woman didn't get us kicked out of the garden by buying an apple and some fruit. It was the men who got us kicked out by breaking the rules of the women. And they broke that rule, and they started hunting them animals. And the first male hunters were the first male cults, because you had to hunt in secret. It was against the rules of the village. So the first male secret societies are synonymous with the rise of the first, what they call civilizations in Egypt and Greece. But people were civilized prior to these times, as I'm explaining now. In fact, these times they give us 3100 BC for the start of civilization is really the start of the opposite of civilization. We're not civilized today. We're barbaric. We're predators. The world we live in today is chaotic, and the way we interact with nature and sustain ourselves goes against nature. This is not civilization. We're still in the fall of civilization, and it's taken it 7,000 years to plummet. And right now we can see that the golden age is coming back around with the rebirth of veganism and consciousness, flat earth, and things of this nature. It's been 7,000 years since we knew this knowledge of ourselves. There's been many people throughout these years trying to let us know. These first male hunters who broke the laws of the village did so in secret, and they brought meat back to these villages, smuggled it back, and people began to get a taste for meat and a craving for meat over time. And to make a long story short, over the years, meat eating became so prevalent that wars began based upon the original laws of the village, which was do unto the animals as we would have them do unto us. The ancestors knew we could destroy the natural ecosystem of this place if we didn't participate in our relationship with the plants, and that if we began to dominate things and rule over things and slaughter things, we knew that according to the laws of karma, we would just be slaughtering ourselves, because everything created in nature has a role. So prior to the dynastic age, nothing dominated another thing, but we had a symbiotic relationship with nature. Now we have a symbiotic relationship with currency, when the true currency is the seed. So back in our natural state, when we were in gardening societies, the seed was the currency. Today, when you go to these churches, you can see that when they pay tithes, they call it sowing seeds. So the money took the place of the seed, which is the real currency. The money even took the place of the human seed, because women don't want to have no more babies because they want to go to work to make more money. So the number one cause of death in this hunting society is also abortion, because when you start predating on something, or when you become a predator, you'll eventually start predating upon yourself when there's nothing else to predate upon. When we created dominating societies where it's full of competition and male domination, domination creates a false pyramid power structure with those evil ones at the top of it. And there's a snowball effect, and ultimately it's nature that's destroyed. And since all things are connected to nature, we are destroying ourselves in this world of domination. So if you think of the power pyramid in our societies that are based upon domination as dominoes, you can see how this chain reaction works. When one domino fall, eventually they all fall. So eventually we all face the same fate of the animals that we prey upon. So hunting societies are dominating societies where there's predator, prey, rich and poor. Whereas gardening societies were gathering societies, and everyone thrived together. There was no gender wars, male versus woman or rich versus poor. We all worked the land together as a herd. So these first male hunters messed up the natural flow of the ecosystems, and when they first started hunting those first animals, they set off a chain reaction of predator versus prey. Certain plants that those animals were responsible to help reproduce became extinct when the male hunters hunted them out. And when those plants became extinct, another animal that depended on those plants for a food source now had to follow suit and become a predator. And over time, there was a sort of a race, because a lot of plant species was dying out, which meant a lot of more animal species was going extinct, and vice versa. So the remaining species that we see on the earth today are basically adapted species, not evolved species, but we have adapted to this new world that we've been thrusted into. And that new world was created in 3100 BC when it was finally established. But we're going to talk about this transitioning area some more as well. What we want to keep in mind is that what happened was adaptation, and that's different from evolution. So this race that I speak of was basically among all the species of the earth to adapt to this new world or go extinct. We went from vegan-based world to now vegan and meat-based, or what's called hunting and gathering societies. But we know no one gathers anymore. All the hunting is done through slaughterhouses. We actually created hell on earth. That race I speak of, it was a race among those creatures and how fast they could each adapt to this new world. The world was changing fast, and so was the way we interacted with nature. And the species that couldn't adapt quick enough are the ones they said went extinct. It had nothing to do with dinosaurs and meteors crashing the earth and all of this stuff. It was the changes that we did to the earth, being humans at the top of the pyramid. So that race I speak of was among the remaining species that we have on earth, adopting meat eating into their societies and or either adapting to a new diet with new plants. So these new adaptations in our diets coincide with the turn of the new age and the shift in consciousness, because you are what you eat. So when we talk about people during the golden age living to be hundreds and hundreds of years old, I think that it's true because they were on a different vegan-based diet. They had a different lifestyle and social structure than the one we've adapted to today. So maybe that's why we only live to be 100, and we don't even live to be that no more, because we've been on a big downward slide and the lifespan is getting shorter and shorter because we're trying to adapt to a genetically modified world as we journey further and further away from Eden or our natural state. Now, we know that if we were all vegans, we wouldn't go extinct. But science want to push the lie that without meat, we couldn't sustain ourselves. Actually, if we keep eating meat, we won't be able to sustain ourselves, because by eating meat, it makes more deserts on the earth. The animals are responsible for spreading the vegetation seeds, so as the humans. Plants reproduce themselves at a faster rate than animals and humans. And again, nature shows us what we're supposed to eat. The body isn't designed to digest meat. Animals run away from you crying and screaming. And the child that's enjoying that egg couldn't kill the chicken if they had to kill it. They would just be a vegan. So naturally, we would have compassion and just have a relationship with the plants. And by doing so, we would be in this Garden of Eden type state of just endless gardens, abundant food. Because the reason a lot of people starve today isn't because there's not enough food. It's because they're just meat eaters. They're drug addicts. Meat is a drug. When you eat it, there's a chemical reaction that your body craves over and over. People starve not because there's not enough in nature. If you have some seeds and some soil, nature can provide for you. But people starve because the men that own the slaughterhouses want a monopoly on the seeds as well. For years, people have escaped poverty by simply being vegan-based societies. And in vegan-based societies, there are typically no governments and no rulers, because everyone is just gardeners living off independently off the land in these autonomous village type settings that we all originated from. There was only a need for government with the first male hunters, because not everyone can hunt, but everyone want meat. But not everyone gonna go chase down big buffaloes and cows and slaughter them up by the millions. Who want to do that dirty work? So if you want meat, you're dependent on someone to provide that meat for you. Whereas if you're just a vegan, you're only dependent on yourself to put a seed in the ground. And how hard is that? You do that without even trying to. And there's so much plant life on earth to sustain us. But the animals can't reproduce themselves quick enough to sustain the meat addiction of today's vampire-based society. And the chain reaction to that is that the plants are going extinct because they're dependent on a lot of the animals that have become meat today on your burgers and things of that nature. They also dependent on us to eat them and reproduce the seeds, but we're too busy eating meat. And the plants we do eat don't have seeds because they're GMO. That's because we're so far from our natural state, our Garden of Eden state. In these early settlements, the first male hunters that got us kicked out of this natural vegan garden state broke the laws and formed the first male cults. Meat became an addiction. It's still an addiction today. It's a drug. And that's what happened in those villages that took us from gathering societies to hunter-gathering societies, because now these first male hunters had created addicts. And once you bite into the meat, you become a vampire, like they teach you in the movies. Meat was smuggled back into the villages over the years, and over the years, it just became a normal thing of some people eat meat and some people still upheld to the original vegan laws of nature. And that was a war that broke out based upon the meat-eating societies and the original vegan-based societies. And that was called the gender wars, because the vegan-based societies were fighting for Mother Nature and the old spiritual worship of the womb. And remember that the earth is a womb which provides for us. So this is a macro spirituality of people who lived according to womb-based spirituality, and they provided themselves sustenance from the earth naturally based upon these ideologies of going to the great womb or the earth to eat only the plants that is provided from the womb of the earth. And when they take the seed from the womb of an animal for sustenance, everything was vegan, just like the Garden of Eden said. But the first hunters got us kicked out of the garden by doing the first hunting, and by man being at the top of the pyramid, as above, so below. When we started hunting and becoming predators, a lot of the animals had to copy off us and become meat eaters, incorporate meat in their diet in order to sustain themselves based upon this new concept of hunting, which made a lot of lands barren, because a lot of those animal species, like I said, were responsible for creating a lot of the plant species. And so over time, with meat eating introduced in these villages, we were slowly leaving the Garden of Eden. And this is a social exodus, and we're entering a new age of hunting societies with the beginning of Narmer and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. So we didn't have sophisticated tools when we were in our garden phase. We just had small, simple tools to work the land, and everyone was gatherers. But with the rise of hunting also became the rise of more sophisticated tools like the bow and arrow, the plow started to be made to do massive forms of agriculture, because now you had a lot of barren areas. When you started hunting, a lot of places became deserts. So now we had to create bigger tools to do the gardening and the agriculture on massive levels, which also took a strain on the soil and the land, because now we're not doing it naturally. We're not doing it the natural way nature intended for the human to eat the plant and interact with the fruit, and the seed to go through the human body and be distributed out. During that time when we was doing that, that was the golden age, or the Garden of Eden. Plants were abundant. We were all vegans. We didn't worry about what we was going to eat. Every step you took was a different kind of fruit you can decide, and nuts and things of that nature. This was the kind of diet we had, grains and fruits. Then with the first male hunters, we left this abundant vegan-based society to everyone today. You fast forward time, is craving meat, and it costs money to manufacture meat. It's very expensive to run a slaughterhouse and manufacture meat, whereas it's literally free to produce fruits and plants. So when we talk about sophisticated tools versus simple tools, a simpleton would be what's called a square or a righteous person. They're really not into the sophisticated, complex social structure today. They more of a naturalist, would be more of some of these what they call primitive tribes that's living in nature today off the land. That's what a simpleton would be. So when we talk the simple life, we're talking the heavenly life. Everything is simple. And when we talk sophisticated tools versus simple tools were made for a simple way of living. Sophisticated tools are those of the sophist. So the root word of sophisticated or sophistication is sophist. And you see the word Sophie or sophist in the word philosophy. So the sophists were types of philosophers that based their philosophies on fallacies. These were patriarchal men in power who were helping rewrite mythology and reverse the roles, taking us further away from the knowledge of Eden. These were true patriarchal sophists. Life was simple during the old world matriarchy, therefore we used simple tools. But not only that, everything was very simple to explain through the matriarchy. So you didn't have to go through years at a university to understand the cosmology. Children and grown-ups could all tell the story of the cosmos. And it wasn't exclusive to initiations and degrees of rich men and theological schools and all of this. This is the world of the sophists, because the sophist is complex and so unnatural and away from nature. Think about it. Nature is very simple. The reason the sophist was needed to rewrite mythology is because all of the spiritual literature that was associated with the old world matriarchy had to be done away with for them to perpetuate this new world order system. They had to write new mythology to make it okay to go against nature and to hunt and create this kind of hellhole we live in today. So to do that, they had to cancel the woman out who represent that old world matriarchy. And we'll be going into the transitioning of the mythology and the texts and the cosmology and all of that took place along with the transitioning of the age and the transitioning from Herstory to Hisstory. The sophist mythology is very complex, full of miracles and weird events and things that we don't see naturally happening. This is a sophisticated origination, such as the Big Bang and the heliocentric universe, very complex and sophisticated. Even the scientists themselves will tell you they can't even really explain it. So this is the world of the sophists. When we get away from nature, nothing makes sense, because the world they're explaining to you through their scientism is explained with theories, because they're trying to make an unnatural world that they created make sense, as opposed to we all going back to nature, which makes perfect sense when you start studying the facts of nature. We'll see our roles in it, but we haven't been studying nature. We've been studying theology, scientism, basically how to mimic nature and synthetically reproduce that which already was produced naturally. So when you're trying to justify this type of unnatural ideology morally in spiritual mythology, you have to create a different God that would condone this type of behavior. And deities in the pre-dynastic time had rules against this style of living that we're under today. So that's why they had to change the texts and the spiritual systems and create new deities and mythologies and all of that, and desecrate the old world matriarchal spirituality of the great womb. Now, the form of science we had in this old world and the cosmology we had, like I said, was very simple. But today's is very sophisticated because it's anti-nature, it's unnatural. Again, we're in the world of the sophists. So sophisticated tools were created to suit a more sophisticated world. But these two go against each other. One society works in unison with nature and one works against it. So the rise of meat-eating societies is the rise of working in dynastic societies, because meat eating is looked at as a luxury. One of the main cities in Egypt was named after the word we call luxury today. It was called Luxor. Egypt was the first America. That's why you had a unification there, just like you have the UN here on American soil. All of the nations have their people here serving the beast. You see all of the nations here calling themselves Americans, people of all quote unquote races. This is how Egypt was. We're going to get into that as we move on. We want to get a further understanding of what life was like during this golden age and how we transitioned and the nature of these gender wars. It was a bunch of men and women who were vegans saying, listen, we want to uphold the natural laws and stick to the old laws of the old matriarchy and old laws of nature under the gardening way of living. And then you had a bunch of men and women saying, well, hey, I like meat
And I eat vegetables too, but I don't think nothing wrong with hunting. I don't think it'll mess up much. And you had these two ideologies clashing, and your old world matriarchal vegan cultures was seeing this new rise of hunting, gathering cultures, and they was speaking out saying we breaking the laws of the land by hunting the animals, and it's gonna mess up the ecosystem, and our children gonna suffer. So there was wars, gender wars, because the word gen is the root word of genetics. This shows the origins, because along with these societies was the ideologies of them. So hunting gathering societies had to make new spiritual ideologies to support meat eating, as opposed to the vegan based cultures had the old spiritual systems of nature, which had our true vegan based diet. When we left that vegan based diet, we left the Garden of Eden, and now we ruled over under these synthetic religions that say it's okay to eat meat because it's the male rulers that rose to power with the patriarchs. They actually won the gender wars. That's how we end up in this NWO today. But the matriarch is resurrecting. So those gender wars that led up to the unification of Kemet were simply matriarch versus patriarch. Old pre-dynastic cultures that lived off gardening, that was ruled over by gardeners who knew the secrets of the plants, versus societies who chose to eat meat and have male rulers. Because in societies that's based around meat eating, the males rule because the males do the hunting. So everybody in the society depend on the male hunters, as opposed to the old vegan-based societies depended on the women gardeners who held a knowledge of the plants of the earth. And these women knew which plants and seeds were good for spices, for medicine, for making clothes, for weaving, you name it. And everything that sustained us was plant-based during the golden age. It was abundance because nature creates an abundance of plants. Nature creates that abundance through the animals of the earth. So when you make certain animals go extinct, certain plants go extinct with those animals, and it's a snowball effect. You can see how far we've fallen today. So we see that we left simple gardening tools and a simple golden age to sophisticated tools and hunting societies that's ruled over by males. Life was simple during the golden age. All you had to do was plant the seed. During this new age we're in today, this new world order, it's sophisticated slaughterhouses, which uses chemicals in the animals and steroids and so-called scientific breakthroughs, which genetically modify these animals, because it's not natural for us to herd a bunch of animals in a factory and breed them to consume. That's against the law of nature. The animals, when you put them together like that, disease is inevitable because it's unnatural. Things are meant to move around like the water. They're meant to have free movement and stretching their muscles in appropriate space. Without all of these things, you take a creature out of its natural state, disease becomes prevalent. So most of the meat we eat is disease meat. And they hide the disease with chemicals and steroids and all of these things. But the disease later manifests itself in us when we die from cancer and high cholesterol and all of these different things. When you kill an animal in a slaughterhouse before the animal die, it releases fear chemicals, chemicals of fright, chemicals of sadness. And these are all chemicals that you digest when you eat. So in meat-eating societies like the ones today, antidepressants are prevalent. Human deficiencies and mental illnesses are prevalent when we left our natural garden, vegan-based state. And this happened again roughly 7,000 years ago. And I'm showing you how we transitioned from this golden age pre-dynastic time to this modern dynastic time of government rule and meat-based societies. You can see what we mean by gender wars now. Different ideologies of matriarchal rulership or patriarchal rulership. And the differences was what I just explained. The older natural matriarchal ideologies says nature shows us we shouldn't hunt. Apples aren't running away from you. They're actually seducing you to eat them because they need you to reproduce. That same fragrance that the fruits give off to seduce humans to eat them, we use in soaps and lotions and perfumes that are scented like watermelon, oranges, and they basically reverse the science of nature and put themselves in between us and nature. Nature wore the seductive perfume to seduce you. If you walk past a peach tree, you can't help but pick one. I'm from the South. It smells lovely. And, you know, they got peach flavored perfumes and fragrances and lotions to seduce you the same way. So they learn how to rule over you by studying how nature ruled over us before we left our village-based societies. So basically during this golden age, again, humans were sovereign because there was abundance in plant life and everything was vegan before the first male hunters who created the snowball effect or ripple effect that destroyed the true ecosystem, creating this predator-prey style world that we are in today. This is not our natural state. Nothing is in its natural state. And so we have to get back to our natural state by understanding how we fail. So let's move on. During these gender wars, meat eating was becoming prevalent. It was like a disease. One thing I want to point out is so far what we've went over is that the first Holocaust that took place on the earth was the humans versus the animals. And that first Holocaust led to the gender wars, the matriarchs versus the patriarchs, because the women matriarchs that ruled over us with the secrets of the garden was totally against hunting. Now, when meat eating became prevalent, of course, it was male and female meat eaters. So, yeah, you had a lot of women that gave up their natural sovereignty in their natural place to be ruled over by males who would go out and hunt and provide the meat. So now male hunting cults became bigger and bigger and tools became more sophisticated. And this was the first beginnings of what we call slaughterhouses. So the first Holocaust was initiated on the animals, and all of the wars that took place on the earth after that is just a ripple effect of this first Holocaust. There were no wars prior to this. The first war that ever took place was man going to war against the animals. Now, again, these first male hunters became popular and rich when meat eating became prevalent. And they were like rock stars, just like the secret societies today. Your first secret societies were male hunting cults because hunting had to be done in secrecy when we was transitioning from matriarch to patriarch or pre-dynasty to dynastic time. Before the dynastic time, during this transitioning time of these gender wars, the male hunters were becoming like rock stars, just like how the dope dealers are like rock stars with everybody addicted to the crack. So these hunters became powerful because people was no longer dependent on the gardeners and the great grandmothers and the women who held the secrets of the trees and the vegan-based diet. People was no longer dependent on the plants. They were hooked on meat like we are today. Our diets was starting to change with this shift in consciousness and the beginning of this new age or new world. So with this rise of meat eating was a rise in dependency on male energy, on brute force. During these times, you had to get over your compassion to be able to kill an animal. I'm from the South. I've killed many animals in my life. And I can tell you every time that I've done it, I had to ignore my consciousness because I did feel like I was doing wrong and I felt mercy. I felt compassion. But I had to ignore that in order to go ahead and kill the animal because I was convinced that I had to eat meat in order to survive. So during this time when male hunters were becoming popular and meat eating was on the rise, people were dependent on what they call alpha males. And basically that was the male that could kill at will without having their emotions or feelings get in the way. you would be able to slaughter these animals without having any guilt or consciousness, because you have to be a different kind of person to work in a slaughterhouse. It have to be something that you were conditioned to do, because as a child, your first kill, I'm pretty sure it wasn't as easy as your kill when you were about 30 some years old. By then you conditioned to just ignore your consciousness. Not that it's not there anymore. It's just silent now because you've canceled it out. And we live in a world today that's a result of canceling out our consciousness. And I'm showing you how we fail in consciousness during this transition period. These first male hunters had to be brute men, or what they call alpha males, who was able to kill at will and not care about it. They had to be that way in order to go out and kill in massive numbers and provide the meat to these growing villages, because we were leaving a vegan-based diet to mainly meat-based diets, and these villages was growing. We entered an age of making more sophisticated tools to supply these demands of massive slaughtering and etc. And we had to make tools that would allow us to kill in bulk. So for the first time, man started to think of tools to cause destruction to other creatures. Now man started to fashion tools that would allow him to carry out massive death and genocide for the first time. And we practiced this evil upon the animals first. And if you fast forward time today, you can see we have perfected these sophisticated patriarchal tools of massive destruction. Prior to this, the only tools that we had were for working the earth and maintaining the garden. But with the rise of meat eating, our tools would become more sophisticated, and our tools would morph over time to support our new consciousness shift. So we went from simple, harmless gardening tools to tools that would support meat-eating, hunting-based societies, tools such as bow and arrows, swords, and eventually projectiles. And here we are today, still making some of the most vicious tools you can imagine based upon this downward spiral in consciousness that we've been under the past 7,000 years. And this downward spiral of consciousness is synonymous with the changing of our calendars and our diets. So the vegan-based cultures had calendars that were 360 days based around a perfect sphere, and we'll get into that later. But we need to understand that during the time of these gender wars, how the male hunters rose to power, and we no longer relied on gardeners. We now start to rely upon male hunters and big sophisticated tools. And when you fast forward time today, it's the same way. Male hunters and sophisticated tools and slaughterhouses and chemicals and steroids. And one of the first sophisticated tools that was created in agriculture was the plow. The reason the plow didn't exist during the golden age is because we didn't do what you would call massive scale agriculture back then. It was simply village-based agriculture. You reap what you sow. Meaning when you ate some food or you ate a watermelon, you just naturally spit the seeds out. So that's how the gardening was done. And of course, there was small gardens, but nothing major like we see today with the chemicals being sprayed and the unnatural factory GMO, because nothing was meant to be reproduced in mass that way. Nature already produces everything in mass. Nature created a system of us reproducing the plants, and it was through us eating the plants and throwing the waste down, what you call the waste down, the seeds and the hull. That was the natural way of gardening, along with small village style gardens. You reap what you sowed for your family. What you ate was the seeds you kept to grow your next harvest, so you reap what you sowed. And there was a connection nature had with not only the humans, but with the animals, because it needs us to help spread these seeds around. So when we start to rely on male hunters and societies start to become meat-based societies, again, a lot of plant species went extinct with those animals, and a lot of places became barren. So we saw less vegetation and more slaughterhouses or cattle in concentrations like we see today. We see vast areas of deserted, barren areas and small little vegetated city areas where all of the agriculture is done on massive scales in a controlled, concentrated area. And it's controlled by men or families. And in order for you to eat of the land, you have to purchase it. Whereas everyone was naturally farmers or gardeners, because if you don't work, you don't eat. That's a natural saying that come from you sowing the seeds that would sustain your family and participating in your role in nature, being the vegan you were born to be. With the rise of male hunters, we didn't rely on the earth and on the knowledge of the women and the seeds. We didn't rely on that which would maintain abundance. We started to rely on the mass production of meat through slaughterhouses and the brute force of the male. And that's where we are today. In these meat-based societies, to feed your family, you got to go to work. And how these people rose to power and formed government was through the people getting addicted to meat. So the first hunters started getting rich because people didn't depend on the earth no more. That was when we all was rich. That was the golden age when we all was vegan. When we left that and we started depending on male hunters, we was no longer rich, but the hunters were now rich because we depended on them and not the earth, which sustains us. So for them to provide meat to you and your family, you had to pay. And before money, you just paid with your labor. So you joined the hunting cult, and every man got a portion that was given to him and his family from the day's catch. And the biggest went to the founders of that hunting cult. And if you fast forward time to the day, instead of meat, it's just money. And everything trickled down to the bottom of the pyramid to what's called the peasants. So we eat the crumbs off the rich table. But before that, we just all ate abundantly from the ground, from the earth. You didn't eat the crumbs off the rich man table. But when we got addicted to meat and we entered these meat-eating societies and left the golden age, now we depended on men and we making them rich. So those first hunters controlled who would starve and who would not starve, when people didn't have to starve if they would simply go back to nature where there was an abundance. But if you was addicted to meat and I left you in a house full of fruits and vegetables, you'll starve all day before you make a meal out of them fruits and vegetables. I've seen meat eaters do this. They look around in the house and they say ain't nothing in here to eat, but they have all of these fruits stacked up in a bowl and have all of these veggies in the refrigerator. But since they don't have no meat, they say ain't nothing in here to eat, because they looking at all of these fruits and vegetables as side dishes. They've been taught to see that as side dishes. Now that I'm a vegetarian, my whole plate is filled up with what you would call side dishes. So they would starve if they had to go back to nature and couldn't catch an animal. So during this time when these male hunters rose to power, they was able to rise to power through the meat addiction of the people, the same way the drug dealers are able to have power over the people based upon you're vulnerable if you have an addiction. So when they started supplying the new currency, which was meat, because everybody was addicted to meat now, they control how much meat you get, who get how much meat and which cuts you get. During this time, there was a lot of wars going on based upon if you were an enemy of certain people during this time, you couldn't eat if you was addicted to meat. For example, if I was part of a certain cult, and at the end of the day, because of my high ranking in the cult, I get a huge share of the catchings, and then I got to take my huge share and then split it up and trickle it down amongst my people. Well, if I was a high-ranking member of that cult and I had a huge share of the day's catching and I was at war with someone at the bottom of the pyramid, then they wouldn't get a lot of supply from me. In other words, when males start to be in charge of feeding people through hunting, food became a tool of war now. Certain people who weren't liked, they starved. And the people who supplied the meat weren't supplied if we were enemies. So there were wars. Meat was a currency. It was a luxury, just like it is today. So these first male hunters started becoming very, very wealthy because the people who control the meat now started controlling the farms and agriculture like they do today. They growing the vegetables and the fruit, but they also got the slaughterhouses and the chickens and the cows. This go all the way back to the time I'm telling you now. The people who run all of these industries are what's called royal families. They control the main things that's needed to sustain us. And that's why they are in power. Nature once was in power and sustained everyone equally before people came in between us and nature and got control of the land. And how did they do it? Well, I'm telling you now. The first male hunting cults led up to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, which was the unification of the two world powers, Greece and Egypt, in the beginning of the New World Order, or the first United Treaty. That unification represents the end of those gender wars. Before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was a series of gender wars. And I just explained to you what those gender wars was based upon. People who wanted to uphold the old world matriarchal ways of governing society and interacting with nature versus the new meat-eating cults and hunter-gathering societies that went against the natural laws of nature and messing up the earth today, taking us away from our vegan roots and natural roots. So during these gender wars, the matriarchs went to war with the patriarchs. And this was the second world war on the face of the earth, because the first war was man versus the animals that kicked us out of the garden. That's what sent us on an exodus out of the garden. And as we transition from pre-dynastic time to dynastic time, this second war during this transition in time is gender war, which was the first war of humans versus humans. And it was simply different humans that went to war based upon matriarch and patriarchal concepts. If you look at the world today, that's basically what's going on. Before the unification of Egypt, there was these gender wars, and Greece still existed during this time. This was called a proto-dynastic time, basically the transition in time between pre-dynastic and dynastic. And during this time was the establishment of the first kingdoms starting from 3100 BC. So they call this the beginning of dynastic time, but day one, year one on a Gregorian calendar is what we get when we count down from 3100 BC. And I will be going into that. I will go into that in detail. What we need to know right now before we can move forward is the nature of these gender wars and the difference between matriarchal societies versus patriarchal societies, veganism and gathering societies versus hunting gathering societies, or mainly meat-based societies. So there are no more vegan-based or gardening gathering societies today. They're either hunter-gathering or just all-right hunting. These superpower was rising on the strength of male hunting cults, which was getting control of the land. At first, we all had inheritances of the land, and it was a matrilineal system through the women, and everyone had their plot of land to sow their seeds. This was your natural inheritance. You had a family crest. With the unification of Egypt, that was the end of those gender wars, and the matriarch lost. So the patriarch's been in power ever since. You no longer have a family crest and an inheritance to the land. You now have a national flag and a citizenship, which is slavery. You can't go and reproduce or get anything from the land. You got to get it through those in power who have control over your inheritance, or the land, which is your inheritance. So we traded our natural inheritance when we started developing the meat-based diets, and we started building governments that would supply these new addictions and ideologies. And we had to rewrite our ideologies and even our spirituality, because the original spirituality had laws that governed against hunting. They were vegan-based laws. So with the rise of hunting societies came the rise of new calendars and new spiritual systems because they had to make new spiritual laws to make hunting and meat eating okay. So the pre-dynastic timekeeping systems was also going away with all of the other pre-dynastic remnants. And the reason for that is because, again, during the golden age, when we were vegans, our calendars was based around the annual flooding that we depended on for our crops. And our calendars were basically based around nature and the growing of crops. Our calendars were 360 days because the ancestors looked at the sky as a canopy or a dome. And we go over that in so many videos. Just check them out. So the sky was looked at as a dome, 360 degrees, and the pre-dynastic calendar was originally 12 months that were 30 days each. And that would give you a perfect 360. But the beginning of the Gregorian calendar, which marks the beginning of time according to the New World Order, has 365 days to account for Julius Caesar and Augustus calendar deception. The ancestors didn't name their months the same names that we have today. Julius Caesar and Augustus didn't exist during the Golden Age time, so you didn't have months called July and August. Yet people who talk about ancient things still base their time off a modern calendar. They still are under Pope Gregory's deception, telling you they're teaching you ancient concepts, when really the word ancient can't be used unless you're talking about pre-dynastic time. No one is going back pre-dynastic because most of the world today don't know about pre-dynastic time. That's the purpose of this series. This time is called Herstory. So the beginning of history is the end of Herstory, which leads us back to these gender wars. The hunters and their families were rising to power. And the bigger your hunting cult was, the people at the top of that cult ran entire villages once these villages were converting into meat-based villages. So you still had a couple of villages scattered out that were solely vegan. And then you had your hunting villages and hunting gathering villages. And that's what the wars were. These groups of villages go on to war based upon ideologies, social structure. Now, to make a long story short, these gender wars over many years led up to the unification of Greece and Egypt under Narmer. And basically that unification was your biggest villages that had unified. Because during these gender wars, a lot of the matriarchal villages were united. So, of course, you know, your hunting villages would connect and combine forces as well. What was happening was meat eating was becoming very prevalent. The taste for meat and cooking had began because tools were now sophisticated to support cooking the meat and the meat eating. Men started to now experiment more with fire, which would lead to projectiles. During this gender war transitioning period, which was a couple thousand years, meat eating became prevalent. And a lot of these villages more and more were becoming more hunting gathering villages than gardening and vegan-based gathering villages. So there start to be more meat-eating societies than vegan-based societies. And now we was entering the beginning of the end of the old world and the beginning of the new world with that transitioning of our diets. Remember that drastic changes in societies are synonymous with the changes in the way those societies interact with the land, which has a huge effect on the diets of those societies. Most of the time, there's a huge change in the diets based upon the huge change in the consciousness. Again, as I said, vegan-based societies had a different spirituality and consciousness that prevented them from eating animals, and they understood the knowledge of nature and being green. The rise of the hunting societies meant turning the back on old spiritual practices and people rebelling on their grandmothers and mothers' vegan ways of the old world, adopting new ideologies that supported hunting societies and said that meat eating is okay. And I'm going to show you later in this series how every society transitioned, how they left veganism goddesses in their spirituality to male meat-eating, condoning patriarchal gods in their religions. But first we have to start here at these gender wars and understand what was taking place on the earth. Meat eating was becoming prevalent, and the old ways of the natural golden age were dying. And that led up to the patriarch ruling and being put on a throne, which ended those gender wars with the unification of the first two world powers. And those first two world powers were born out of royal families. And those royal families was born from rich hunting cults. The hunting cults got control over the land and the people through the people's addiction and the change of their diet. And when the people gave up their land to go to work to put meat on their plate, the people who own the slaughterhouses also gained ownership of the gardens or the land that the people own. So your first world governments and the first rulers of the earth, you often forget that these pharaohs and kings own thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land and cattle and farms and slaughterhouses. And it's these things that sustain us: food, water, shelter, and the earth provides it all. So when we became addicted to the meat and not addicted to that which sustains us, which is nature, now we're like junkies waiting on the dope man, as opposed to gardeners who was getting our hands dirty, interacting with nature, doing what we were supposed to do to feed ourselves abundantly. So the first world government took place in Egypt with this unification of the Egyptians and the Greeks or the Romans. And during this time, these two cultures, like most of the world, was in a very mixed setting. So we're looking at an Egypt that was full of all quote unquote races. And there had to be, in order for there to be this unification. Today, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge the fact that Egypt was very mixed during the beginning of these first dynasties, and there was more than one ruler. So this unification was the beginning of world government. And when we talk about Egyptians, every culture identified themselves as Egyptian, and for many years the different quote unquote races have argued about who are really the Egyptians. Because when you start going through Egypt, you see the influence of all the quote unquote races, just like if you were to go through America. It was a melting pot. During this time, you had people of all races who ate meat and people of all races who hate meat, who were vegans. This was matriarchal versus patriarchal, and it was people of all different shades on each side. There have always been since the beginning of this war. What we became to know as Greece and Egypt today was birthed from a union of autonomous villages and a war that took place from those villages transitioning from gathering societies or gardening societies to hunting societies. So needless to say, the hunting societies won that war, and here we are today. So the end of those gender wars represented the victory of those patriarchal hunting societies and the beginning of government under this one guy who they call Narmer, who's known by many names. We're going to talk about him more later. But he's just a pseudonym for the real powers who are hiding themselves behind this fake history.
I just want to say I really appreciate you all for tuning into the video. I hope that you learned a lot. I know many of you have many questions, so just stay tuned. I will be going live and I will be accepting questions and I will be answering questions and all of that good stuff. And this is going to be an extended series of videos. There's so much to go into. Like I said, this was just an extended introductory overview of the whole timeline. So I really appreciate you all for tuning in. Make sure you follow me with this series because it's only going to get better and better and the rabbit hole is going to get deeper and deeper. Be on the lookout for part 2 and many more parts as we journey from her story to his story. Peace and much, much love.